Welcome to another session on the Innotribe stage, our second session of the day. Today, we have an awesome speaker for you. Now, Pascal Coppens is a renowned keynote speaker, tech entrepreneur, social media influencer, author, with over 20 years strategic experience of living in China and Silicon Valley. He delivers his insights into everything about technology and innovation with a particular focus on China. Now, this is not the first time we've had Pascal on stage, both in person and virtually. Back in 2019, on the stage at Innotribe in London, he delivered a keynote on technology in China. And then in 2022 in Amsterdam, unfortunately, he had COVID, but still managed to join us remotely and deliver another insightful and impactful performance. So please welcome to the stage Pascal Coppens, but just before he comes on, stick around at the end of the session, because at the end of the session, right over here, Pascal will be signing copies of his book, China's New Normal, so stick around to get your own signed copy. And welcome to the stage, Pascal Coppens.
Go!
女士们、先生们，上午好。30年前，我和我太太，我们就在北京上学。那他是艺术家，那我们住在工艺美术学院。那我和我太太，我们在这里交了很多朋友，慢慢的开始了解中国。Don't worry, I'm going to speak English. I just was saying that 30 years ago, in 1996, I was studying in China, in Beijing. This is my wife, we're both from Belgium. She's an artist, and so we were staying at the University of Art, or the College of Art. I was studying Chinese, and I must say, that year, in 1996, was the first year of 20 years living in China. But it's the only year studying the language that for me and for my wife felt very slow. All the other years was like a high-speed train. And I want to take you along on the journey of my story of this high-speed train. And I want to start with China's first miracle, which started 6 years before that. And that was the very first time in 1990 that I arrived in China. This is me, young, naive, beautiful. Back then, just like the landscape, and I traveled through the country for 2 months. This was a wonderful experience. But one of the first things that I truly noticed was how uncomplicated China was in 1990. So simple. People were on a bicycle, all the people were still wearing a Mao suit, the skies were blue, and this was the beginning of the industrial transformation that we in the West helped to fuel. But what truly shocked me was how poor China was. There was 754 million people living below the extreme poverty line. That is less than $2 a day, less than $60 a month. I took a lot of pictures back then. As you can see, China was extremely poor only one generation ago. But in 30 years' time, they've taken out that whole extreme poverty out of the country. Today, it officially stands at 0. This, in my view, is the biggest miracle in humanity. I mean, 80% of all the extreme poverty in the world was eradicated from China, and because of that, the whole world was a lot less poor. Now, how did the Chinese do that? Well, hundreds of millions of people went to the factories to build the products we all love so much everywhere in the world. But the question is, why did China become the factory of the world? Because very often we think about, well, lots of poor people want to work really hard. I mean, that's how they got the factory. But then why didn't India become the factory of the world? Or Indonesia? Or somewhere in Africa or Latin America, or many places that are poor or were poor, very poor back then, and could have done the same thing. And I believe, honestly, it has everything to do with culture. The Chinese culture, and I want to talk a little bit about it. Chinese are good at three things, very good at three things. The first thing they're good at, they're very coordinated. They learn as a kid truly to be the best in class, the number one. They want to be the expert in their own domain. This is what they learn at school. And then they pass that along to the next one. And that, of course, in factories, in production, is very useful if everybody wants to be the best in his vocational domain. But it's also a collective society. What that means is that when the Chinese trust each other, they trust their friends, they trust their family, they trust their colleagues, and they trust their leader, they all like to go into one same direction. They feel safe and strong in numbers. But the most important, in my view, is the creativity of Chinese. Chinese are extremely creative. Now, I know some of you might think, Pascal, what are you saying? Come on. I mean, they cheat, they spy on us, they copy everything, and some of them, they learn everything at heart at school. I mean, come on, they're not creative, are they? But give them a problem. My experience is they're some of the best pragmatic problem solvers in the planet. But they need a problem very often because they have no time to spend on creativity very often that is beyond that. And so the Chinese are very creative in solving issues. And that in manufacturing is always something you need to have. Because there's always delays of products, there's always payment issues, there's always supply or quality issues. Now, I know you want to continue watching these movies, but unfortunately, they've given me 45 minutes and I need to keep going. So, people who didn't go to the factories, what they did is they went to the cities. Cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen. Shenzhen didn't exist 40 years ago. It was a fisher village. Today, it's 20 million people. Shanghai, a city where I lived for 18 years, doubled its population in just one generation, in 30 years' time, from 13 million to 25 million people. And they've built the most beautiful skylines in the east. But it's not just those two cities. There's more than 100 cities in China with more than 1 million people. If you would be able to go back 30 years, you would not recognize the city. That is a transformation that this country has gone through in just one generation time. But the biggest transformation, in my view, that I experienced has everything to do with the middle class. We're talking today about 230 million families belonging to the middle class. That is about 500 to 600 million people that have the same wealth as people in the middle class in Europe or in America, any developed country. But what that also means is that there's still 800 million people that are living in poverty. Not extreme poor anymore. They have most of the things they need, but they're not rich, they're not well off. And so that means that China's big dream, Chinese dream for the next 30 years, 20 years, and this is what the policy is in Beijing is all driven by, is to take all these 800 million people into the Disneyland of the middle class. And that's the whole idea. So that drives a lot of the policies. But I'm going to start my story in 2008. Because 2008 is honestly where everything changed. This is the start of the digital transformation. The digital transformation is the moment in China in 2008 where 3G licenses of telecommunications were made available. It means for the very, very first time, Chinese could send data with their smartphone. They could buy smartphones. The iPhone came out in 2007. But before 2008, most Chinese families did not have a phone at home. They had a public phone. They didn't have a PC or a laptop. So they jumped straight into the mobile area. 10 years later, 98% of all the Chinese on the internet were on the internet with a mobile phone. China is a mobile-only, mobile-first country. And they're seriously addicted to their phone. I mean, it's way worse than anywhere else in the world. Can it be worse? Yes, it can. But why is that? It's because the past 15 years, since 2008, every application that was ever built in China was built for mobile. And so the user experience and the consumer or customer experience is much better because we were still building for browsers, for websites, and maybe for mobile. Now we made the switch due to the pandemic, but the Chinese did that 15 years earlier. The result is that they're truly constantly glued to their phone. Now, from time to time, a Chinese ends up in a fountain. But China would not be China if they wouldn't be able to solve this problem, right? So China's building this digital path towards the future. And so if we want to understand our digital future for tomorrow, my suggestion is always start from the digital past of China from before the pandemic. This little girl here on the left here, 5, 6 years old, she's buying some noodles in a shop in Shanghai in 2019 with her smartwatch as if this is the most normal thing in life. She's never known real cash. She will never use it in her life until maybe she visits the Museum of Europe. This woman here, what she expects you to do, scan your QR codes. I'm sure some of you might have done that this week. And if you take out your wallet, give her a credit card, debit card, or you give some cash money, one chance of the two, she starts laughing. It happened to me. It happens to most foreigners visiting China for the very first time. But that's the old normal. The new normal today is all about face payments. If you go into a convenience store in many places in the big cities in China, you can just smile, scan your face, and everything's paid. You don't need to touch anything. On the market, they're even giving you a remote scanner to buy your vegetables or your fruit. And if you want to get something from a vending machine, or if you want to get something here from a subway, you don't need a ticket anymore. You want to get a plane, you don't need a boarding pass. You want to get something from a vending machine like here, the only thing you need to do, bend down, and the person behind you will pay for you. So now you understand what the meaning of cashless is, right? You don't need cash in China, you just need people behind you standing in line. Now, the biggest transformation of this whole mobile payment has everything to do with this. It's e-commerce. Singles Day is the biggest e-commerce festival in China. It's also the biggest in the world. It's like Black Friday or Amazon Prime if you're in the US or Europe. And this is created by Alibaba many, many, many years ago. And on Singles Day in 2021, these are the last numbers that were made available, Alibaba sold on its platforms in just one shopping festival for $84 billion in goods. $84 billion. That's the GDP of Luxembourg, the whole value of a country for 1 year. Sold that in just 1 week of shopping festival. And JD.com, Jingdong, the competitor of Alibaba, the Amazon of China, sold for $40 billion in that same festival. It's crazy. If you sell for 124 billion, so Alibaba and JD together, 124 billion US dollars, that means 4 billion packages you need to distribute. Do you know how many 4 billion packages is? It's a lot of packages. Now, both Alibaba and JD were able to distribute all these packages in 40 days' time, 40. By New Year, everybody has its package because Singles Day is on November 11. Now, I'm from Belgium, and in Belgium we have the Belgian Post. And we're a very small country, but the Belgian Post, since the pandemic, is doing about 500,000 packages a day, so I thought I'd calculate, what if the Belgian Post would have to distribute 4 billion packages from one shopping festival in the very small country of Belgium? I can tell you the last person would have gotten his or her package after exactly 40 years. So we're talking about 40 years as opposed to 40 days. And that's an efficient, developed country like mine. How is that possible? Well, it's very simple. It's all about automation. Today, 52% of all the industrial robots in the world are sold in China. Half of all the robots. And half of that, 25% of all the robots in the world are built in China for China. What that means is that China is becoming the most robotized place on the planet. And when we think about the factory of the hands, I mean, they're disappearing very, very fast. They're going to the global south more to Southeast Asia. But in the factory of the robots, that's the future. Now, if you look at all that consumption, if you look at all that production, there's one big issue. It's pollution. And I've lived in China during the pollution. There were days I didn't want to go outside. It was that bad. That's 10 years ago. So China still emits 27% of all the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So a huge issue. So simply said, if China's not going to solve that problem, our grandchildren are going to have a hard place on this planet. It's as simple as that. Now the good news is that Xi Jinping, in 2020, 4 years ago, he promised at the General Assembly of the United Nations that by 2060, in a little bit more than 30 years from now, China will be carbon neutral, CO2 neutral. Now, a lot of people are saying, yes, I mean, it's easy to say these things, but can we really trust China? That's a different name of a different book, but let's not go there. The question is, we have to look at the capacity. And if you look at the capacity, what you see that the last 5 years, China has built 4 times more renewable energy capacity than the European Union, 5 times more than the US, 8 times more than India. Maybe we don't need to do as much in those areas, but China is really putting everything in. So that is the good news. And so I believe that this is really going to happen, maybe even before the European Union will be carbon neutral. Now I want to start my second miracle of China, which I experienced in 2015. This is the moment where it was all about becoming a smart nation. That's the moment where the Chinese truly thought, we need to go from quantity to quality. We need to go from copycats to creators. Now, it's easy said, but how are they doing it? Well, it started top down. Xi Jinping and the State Council said in 2015 very clearly that by 2020 and 2030, China wants to be an innovator. By 2030, they want to lead the world in terms of innovation. Now, that created all the tensions that we're constantly talking about today between China and the US. It started with a telecommunication war with Huawei, ZTE, and so on. Later on, it became geopolitical. Then, under Trump, it became a trade war, a COVID war. I mean, you name it. And under Biden, it was a lot about technology. I mean, a lot of this Chip Act, Biotech Act, and so on. So what you see is that ultimately, this is all driven, or much, by the ambition to dethrone America from its innovation power. That's at least how many Chinese think. But only 12 years ago, we were 100% convinced in the West that China would take at least 20 years to become innovative and probably never catch up with us. Why would they? How could they? These same magazines, 8 years later, talk about this technology supremacy race between China and the US on AI and every possible application, where we're not sure anymore who's leading and who's behind. So how did we not see this coming? For me, living in China, it was so obvious this was going to happen. What did we miss? And I think there's a lot of things we missed, but there's one thing, crucial thing, that we all missed in the West. It has everything to do with talent. There's a lot of talent in China. Now, where do you find talent in China? You can go and look in a lot of places, but the best place to look for talent is on a job fair. So if you go on a job fair, for example in Shanghai here, no problem to find talent. Lots and lots of people. Every year there's 12 million graduates from university in China. 12 million people, that's the whole population of my country, Belgium, that graduate from university. And out of these 12 million people, half of them graduate with an engineering degree or something related with engineering. This is a graph from 2016 when there was 10 million graduates, and you see 4.66 million were graduating with a science, technology, engineering, or math degree. 37% of all the engineers in the world are coming out of this country. And then in India, there's 21%. So those two countries together is 2/3 of the world's engineers graduating. And take another few countries in Asia, and you have 3/4 almost from all the engineers in the world are coming from this region. So when people challenge me and say, yeah, but China, they're still copying, and can they really innovate, and so on, I say, of course they can. There's smart people everywhere in the world. It's just China and India have many more of them. It's not their fault, they just have more people. And so that is really what it's all about. Now, they're not just in quantity, often engineers with a lot of capabilities, often they're also in quality very good. There's a mathematical Olympiad every year, and this was held in Japan last year, 17-year-old kids that compete for mathematics, and every single year, pretty much both boys' team and girls' team, they get the number one are Chinese. I mean, they beat everybody every year. Anybody know who number two is? Sorry? India. That would be logic, but it's not. Actually, it's America. These are the Americans. I rest my case. Now, is China ahead or is China behind? Well, ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, that is a think tank in Australia that advises the government and the military or the defense organization, they made this research, and they checked who is, of the 44 most critical technologies in the world, who's ahead and who's behind. And they came up that out of these 44, 37 of them, China is already leading the world. These are critical technologies for economic development, but also national sovereignty and national security. So America is only in 7 places, according to ASPI, still ahead. Now, there's a long list. You can download it online, so you don't need to take copies. But if you do take pictures, make sure that I'm in it, in these pictures. But you can take pictures, but ultimately, you can just download the whole report. And what really worries me as a European is that you don't find Europe in there. And this was done for the whole world, and it's true. European countries and Asian countries and other countries in the world, they all came in number 3, 4, or 5, but not number 1 and 2. So when people talk about a US-China technology war, it's very clearly why. If you look at the US, of course, there's things like vaccines. I mean, that I don't need to explain that these days anymore. Quantum computing, ChatGPT, AI chips or chips in general, small satellites. These are the things from the US. But I follow news every day about China from every media outlet possible. And when I read things, specifically from things like New York Times or the Washington Post, that China still cannot innovate, I always notice that it's always one of these 7 technologies where the US is still ahead. So the question is, are we really truthful towards ourselves? Or do we still believe, that we are in the center of the world when it comes to innovation? Well, it's more and more leading towards Asia. I have a newsletter every month where I talk about all these innovations coming out of China. You can scan the QR code if you want it. It's about 8 new innovations. And the reason I think it's interesting, not just because I write it, I mean, that's of course one of the reasons, but the main reason is because very few people talk about it. Very few people talk about these innovations coming out of Asia. But these are innovations that are really mind-boggling innovations. It's moonshot innovations, like Google would say it. Things that can change the world for the better, that can have an enormous impact on the planet, on society, on the way that we live. But we don't talk about it. China has more patents and research papers scientifically than any country in the world. And we don't talk about it. Now, one of my favorite ones is this one, flying cars. And the reason it's one of my favorite ones is very simple. When I was a kid, very, very young, I was dreaming, I was believing, honestly, that by the age that I am now, that I would be flying in a car. I mean, I loved these science fiction movies, and I thought at least people who could afford it would be flying cars. I'm seriously disappointed in technology. Of course, we got ChatGPT now, so that helps a little bit. But what is now the big difference? Well, in China, this company called Xiaopeng, this is a company that 2 years ago launched their first flying car in Dubai. And they started developing this 10 years ago. So there's another company called Yihang, which I've been in one of these flying taxis. It's really fabulous. And they have a plan to have 1,000 flying taxis in Shenzhen in the next years to come. This is crazy. We're going to see the world change. So what is the real difference, in my view, if you drill it down to innovation coming from the West and innovation coming from China, it's one simple thing. The Chinese started dreaming much shorter than we have about these innovations. Their return on dreams is much shorter, and because of that, they're wanting to innovate much faster than we are, because they've seen the result of their innovation happening in just their own lifetime, and usually within 5 or 10 years. And when everybody around you basically innovates and you see the results, you want to do it yourself as well. Same for India. And that makes the huge difference. But these Chinese dreams are often nightmares for us. We don't like the Chinese dreams outside of China. We feel uncomfortable, we feel threatened. What is this all about? And we're talking more and more about, is China a risk or is it an opportunity? And in Europe, we're talking about de-risking the whole time. And I'm always wondering, what does it mean and why do we think like that? I mean, having been in China for so long, having seen these factories and the efficiency and the infrastructure that they've built, and the willingness to work so hard and very often, I'm wondering, how are we going to compete with what's happening in China? But we need to diversify. We all understand that. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. It doesn't matter whether it's China or any country in the world. So we need to somehow figure out what the rest of the world can offer us. But the problem is we're looking at it from a risk perspective. We should look at it from an opportunity perspective. There's so many opportunities outside China, specifically in the global south happening, but we're going there because we don't want to be in China, and that is the wrong mentality. Because the Chinese don't think like that. They go there because they see an opportunity. And so my view is we need to keep one leg in China, one leg outside China, and we need to have a balancing act between China and the rest of the world, because things are happening outside. And you have to follow the Chinese, because the Chinese next opportunity is in the global south. What we're forgetting is that 80% of the population is living there, more than 80%. And that is where the Chinese are now heading. So I always say, if you want to de-risk from China, follow where the opportunities are, where the Chinese are going, and you'll be doing well, and you'll probably be working with Chinese in other countries as well. But that's also a different story. I believe China's next opportunity is everything to do with looking not just at the market. The market is huge. I mean, there's a lot of wealth, but it's not just the market. Today, it's more about the fact that this is a place of innovation. It's about R&D, about research, about scientists. That is what you can get. Get resources from China. Don't only try to sell in China. And look at China as a trendsetter, like these flying taxis, like humanoid robots. I mean, a lot of things in biotech and AI, they're really advanced and doing here faster because they love technology. They're also the early adopters in many sectors. So we're talking is, what is AI going to do in banking? Maybe the Chinese figured it out already because they've tried a million things. And most of all, look at talent and look at the middle class. They're growing, they're more sophisticated, and they have a lot of money and a lot of ambition. So I think we need to look beyond the horizon. We can't just look at what we read every day in the media, because it kind of blindfolds for the opportunity that we see here. But the problem is, we're always asking that question. What is China's purpose, really? What do they want? And when you read Western media, you constantly hear about, yeah, they want to become the number one in technology, the number one in military, the number one in resources, the number one. They want everything. And they want to control everything on top of that. But I believe it's much simpler. What the Chinese, in my view, truly want is one thing. They all want to stick together. They know they're in deep and troubled waters. They know they're not good at swimming yet. But they believe if they together can catch that next wave, they're all going to be on that next trend. And they're setting these trends. They're just waiting for that next trend to happen. And that is why I always say China is cyclical. If we look at China too linear, which we mostly do outside of China, we don't understand how the future evolves. China has moments of lots of control. And we just had 4 years of that because of the pandemic, because of regulation. A lot of things changed this country. But now it's 4 years of an upward cycle, but we're still in our mindset in a downward cycle. But the upward cycle is all about giving opportunity. And you see it that now there's stimuli and there's things happening for entrepreneurs and so on. But we're still mentally in that downward cycle. But I've experienced after 35 years of dealing with China that when there's an upward cycle, that's when innovation, creation, and new things are happening. So trust it will happen. We just need to see it. Now, I'm going to go, in my last part of the presentation, to China's next miracle. And this starts about now, this year, next year. This is where I believe China could create that next miracle, that third miracle that could change the world. Now, will they be able to do it or not? I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know. But at least there is a formula. So China's next miracle, it's called New Quality Productive Forces in English. And as you can all read, it makes total sense, right? So you follow this formula and we understand what it means. For those who can't read Chinese, I've put it in English, a little bit easier. It's really about scientific breakthroughs. It's about science, it's about innovation, it's about productivity, it's about implementing it in the industrial applications. So the interesting thing is that innovation and science is going to save China according to their own formula. The second thing, it's all about labor, labor force, labor tools, labor objects. And if you show this to most economists, and I've done this 100 times, they really don't get it. They say, well, what do you mean, a formula for a miracle? You can't create a formula for a miracle. And what are these two things? On top of that, if you separate them out, it looks like it's capitalism and Marxism put in one mix of cocktail. How can you do that? That doesn't make sense. I think it's genius of the Chinese government to put the Marxist part in there because nobody will believe it will ever work. But actually, it makes sense. What they're doing is the red and the blue pill. I don't know if you've watched The Matrix, but actually the Matrix is very simple. You can either take the red Chinese pill, which is really painful reality. We have to get through this pain all together. Remember the swimming pool? It's not going to be easy, but let's do it and we'll get there. The next trend is coming. Or you can just keep on dreaming and build new things and say, well, we just need science, we need technology, we need all these great things, and we'll see where we get. But what the Chinese are doing, and that's the unique miracle, is they're taking both pills. And because they're taking both pills, I mean, they got a good chance that it's going to work. So this is what this new quality productive forces is about. It's about building bridges to that next mountain. And we in Western countries, specifically in America and Europe, constantly say, China's not doing enough, they're not doing the right thing. We want them to jump from one mountain to the other, but the Chinese are building a bridge, and it's a transparent bridge that we don't see. And so that's the real difference. Now, I've tried to explain a little bit what this new quality productive forces means. Basically, it's all about technology. What we've been talking about here the last 2 days, it's all about AI, it's about automation, it's about 5G, 6G, about blockchain, all these things. But it's really about being the first and the best. And mindset of Chinese now is really to become this technology leader. What that means is that a finance company doesn't see itself as a finance company, but as a fintech, or I would call it a tech-fin company these days. And that's the bit different mindset. And then they want to implement that in every industry possible, specifically in B2B. But when we think about innovation, we often think about B2C coming out of China. Tencent with WeChat, Alibaba, ByteDance with TikTok, it's all B2C. But B2B is where it's all going to happen these days, and specifically in the service industry. I believe if that next miracle could happen, is that China could become the service factory of the world, specifically for the Global South. And so we need to be very careful, because our future competitor in the Global South will be China. And then we got generative AI. I mean, we've all been talking about this since 2 years, non-stop. I mean, it's like there's no other topic anymore. But in 2022, the whole world was shocked and surprised by ChatGPT, and so was China. And everybody was taken by surprise. But we often believe that, yeah, what's happening in China? Are they doing anything? We don't talk too much about it in Western media. In Europe, I don't read a lot of it about coming out of China. But they're doing a lot. And we heard it just at the panel before that. There's a lot of things happening. If you think about customer services or customer-centric, chatbots, if you think about all the things that is related to sales, I mean, there's a lot of applications happening with large language models these days. You have a news anchor these days, many of them 24/7 available in 30 different languages, whatever you want, and just aggregate all the news from all the world and just spin it out so you can listen to whatever you want whenever you want it. That's the end of CNN, if I look at it that way. You can even get a boyfriend in China on an app, or a girlfriend. You just download the app, you create your own boyfriend or girlfriend, like you feel that's kind of the person I want. And the interesting thing is that they always listen. I mean, a boyfriend or girlfriend that always listens, isn't that the dream of everyone? And they like to please. And that's one of the things that generative AI is very good at, is pleasing people. So this works very well. What we see as well is that at Alibaba, they have an employee now with a KPI to have 20% of the code developed by this chatbot or this virtual large language or generative AI model. We have now here on the left top, this is on the right top, we have a company, a NetDragon. It's a gaming company. They've even decided to make their CEO a virtual avatar. There's still a real CEO on top of it because they need to make sure that there's some liability and accountability, but that person is already, which isn't real, making 70% of the decisions of this gaming company. And then if you talk about influencers, we could talk a long time about that. The person in the middle is not real, if you wonder. She will sell you stuff 24/7. And she has hundreds of thousands of followers, and people trust her enough, she's not real, to buy her products based on her recommendation. I mean, this is all going crazy. But what it means, some of these things will work, some of them will not work. But what's interesting is that there's more than 200 large language models in China, or at least generative AI models, that are being used everywhere into the applications. And we don't talk about it. It's because ChatGPT is blocked in China that we have all these guys. And they're really good. They were talking about it, Kimi from Moonshot AI, just before that. But we don't know about these things happening. And we have to look at the application, because that's the question we're all asking us. So in my view, what the Chinese want to do with this new quality productive forces is just to educate the people more, to become scientists. And so when you have a population of 1.4 billion people, it's very easy to tap into that resource, because the basic education that they have in school is pretty good. Now you just need to use that resources, and this is the oil of China. The oil of Saudi is actually the brains in China. And so that's what it's all about. And so what the Chinese want to do is build blue oceans. I don't know if you're familiar with blue oceans, but blue ocean strategy in business schools is like when you create a new market, something, you set a standard. I mean, think about Uber, or think about other companies from Google and so on that really set a standard, and then everybody has to follow, and everybody's always behind. This is what we're good at in the West, specifically in America and in Europe. But there's a reason why we're good at building blue oceans and building uniqueness. That's why we call them unicorns, these companies. It's because it's based very much on our culture, and we're not always making that link. We're not always thinking that our culture actually defines who we are. And many companies, multinationals, have actually European or American or Western background. They actually are often, in the past, based on religion, Catholicism, Christianism, or Judaism. I mean, it's all about wanting to do something good, have a purpose in life, good for the planet, good for humans, good for... I mean, this is fantastic, because we build great things for humanity, but it's based on our culture and our beliefs very often, even if we don't believe anymore. And the Enlightenment is also something that influenced us very much in the 17th and 18th century, and that is where the individual is central, and so also the creation and using our minds and rationality. And so we value a lot of the individuals, we value that individual creation. And of course we need institutions, we need laws to make sure that this is all independently judged and protected, and we feel good about continuing to create. But we don't think about it. But the Chinese, they actually have not been influenced by religion, by a lot of philosophies, but not religion. They have not been influenced by the Enlightenment. And the institutions came mainly the last decades when they wanted to be part of the international community. And so they have been influenced by very different things. Taoism, legalism, Confucianism, also Buddhism a little bit. But these three have made all the difference in terms of innovation. And we don't think about it. But why do the Chinese innovate differently than we do? It's also because their background, their culture, their civilization, and the way that they think is different than the way that we think very often. I'll go to all three very, very quickly, but I'm not going to give you a lecture on Confucianism or legalism. But if we start with legalism, which is the ones that we know the least, and they're all 2,500 years, all at the same time as the Greek philosophers. And so the legalism was really about creating results. This were a philosophy where people or where the philosopher believed that people were born selfish, not so good. And so you need rules, you need regulation, you need strict follow-up, you need constantly to monitor people, because otherwise things get out of hand. And this is very much because of the red ocean of China. We think about blue oceans, but the Chinese, when they see a market, they all jump into that same market. Think about electrical vehicles. I mean, suddenly there's 400 companies building electrical vehicles, all for that market. Now we're not happy about that, but it's the reality. It's because they all want to compete in that red ocean, and the red ocean is a market where there's a lot of customers, a lot of opportunity. I don't call it a red ocean, I call it a bloody ocean, because it's a bloody gladiator fight to the death to survive in the Chinese market. I've done it, and I've suffered as much as I've succeeded. But this has all to do with surviving. And China has often been, for the past 40 years, into a survival mode. And they have learned to compete. And we have forgotten how to compete in most of the places in the West. DJI, the biggest drone company in the world, they actually have a formula, or they have a way of innovating, where every time they create a new drone, so they build a new drone, they put 2 or 3 teams in competition with each other, and the team within the company that wins, have the best project, the best drone, can take it to the market. They get budget, they get P&L, they get more people from other teams if they want to join, or these teams can compete for that next project and then create their own team again. So it's positive competition, and the logic behind it, if the market out there is extremely competitive, I mean cutthroat, then why do you want a company where everybody feels safe and comfortable and we all love and like each other? It doesn't make sense. You're not learning to compete inside the company, you're not going to do it well outside. Very different way of thinking. Now the second one has to do with Confucianism. And this has everything to do with relationship. We call it guanxi in Chinese. But it's about creating this relationship and trust between people, because you do business with people. You don't do business with just NDAs and with lawyers and so on. You do business with people in China. And that, I call that a wolf pack culture. And a wolf pack culture means that you have small teams, because if you have big teams, you can't create that same trust. You have small teams, but just like wolves, they're constantly out the outlook. They're trusting each other, they're helping each other, they're always hungry and trying to figure out what's next, and very agile. And that is driven by that relationship of trust in China. And I always say you can never ever beat Chinese on speed. You can beat them on many things, on project management, on branding, on marketing, on whatever you can think of. But when it's purely about speed, they're always faster. That has been my experience of 35 years of China. I'll give you a few examples. Here on the left, what you see, this is a railway station here, that they had to put the tracks again for the high-speed train. Overnight, in 1.5 kilometers or 1 mile long, with 1,500 people, they did that in 9 hours' time. 9 hours later, the train tracks were laid, and the high-speed train could just continue through the train station. This is here the 2 hospitals in Wuhan. You heard about that, built in 10 days each. I mean, building a hospital in 10 days. How do you do it? The first days were a few problems, but later on they fixed that. This is a hotel here, 57 stories, built in 3 weeks' time. Completely furnished. I mean, how do they do it? I mean, it was all prefabricated, but still. And here you see how they built these high-speed train tracks, the pillars and the beams at an enormous speed. They've built 40,000 kilometers since 2008. So Chinese are addicted to speed. We're addicted to efficiency. And that is the big difference. So what about quality if you do it at that speed? Well, it's simple. Quality in China, it's terrible. I mean, the worst products in the world you get from China. It's simple. But the second time they do it a little bit better. The third time they do it a little bit better. By the 10th time they've done it, they've often exceeded the quality that we started off with. And that is it. It's not just about deciding fast, it's about learning fast at the same time. But they decide fast, and deciding fast is not just about starting things, it's also about stopping things. Chinese, when it doesn't work, they kill projects very quickly. But on top of that, whether they succeed or they fail, they learn from it. And I think that's the big difference. Now, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, once said that in the new world, the new normal, it's going to be not the big fishes eating the small ones, but the fast fishes eating the slow ones. And the Chinese are just addicted to speed. So that is an advantage. But on top of that, they work in partnerships, they work in trust, they work in relationships. So they create what we call these ecosystems. That brings me to the last philosophy, where it's all about Taoism. We know that much better because that has come to the rest of the world. It's about change, about nature, and about adaptability and stuff like that. But it's mostly about ecosystems and keeping everything sustainable. Now, we are building all ecosystems in Western companies. That's what we talk about constantly. But we talk about alliances and partnerships and how to build all that. But the Chinese do it on 3 other levels. They build ecosystems beyond the partnerships, also within the company, with the people. Within Haier, which is the biggest white good company in the world, like washing machines and so on, they have now 8,000 departments. Each of them are like 15 to 20 people large. And they are not, as the founder called it, not managing people, but making businesses or small businesses and entrepreneurs from all of these companies. And they can constantly bid for new projects that are coming. And they decide themselves what they want to do within the company. It's very interesting. If you want to read a book about it, it's called Startup Factory. I can truly recommend it. But they're also building ecosystems in their products. Think about Alipay. It's not just about an app for financial services. It's also about a social platform. It's about connecting with merchants. And it's also about making sure that everything you need for your life you can actually use with Alipay. And what's the advantage of that? Is that people who use Alipay, which I do constantly, or WeChat, is that we open this app 20, 30 times a day. Well, if I use my bank app in Belgium and I open it, I do that maybe once or twice a day max, sometimes not for a whole day. And so they don't know what the customer or user journey is in many countries in the West, and China, they do, because they follow the users. But it's also the government, and that's very interesting to look at the government, because the government is what we got most wrong when it comes to China. We see this as a top-down society, but the reality is that in Beijing, where we're now, they're setting initiatives, setting the direction, setting goals, and then the local governments are like a flying wheel to get these entrepreneurs who all compete with each other to say, these are the best projects. They're like VCs within this community, and they're trying to get these entrepreneurs to become the best so that their city becomes the best, because their city is also competing with other cities in China, and that's their way to actually connect all these dots. And it's a positive competition, but that means that entrepreneurship is because of that driven. And we're forgetting about these local governments doing that. We're always thinking about local governments as the debt problem and the real estate problem. We're forgetting about what they do for innovation. So I believe you read very often that the end of China's miracle is over. It could also be the beginning of a new miracle or a next miracle. It really depends if you look at the glass half full or half empty. And depending on your starting point, you will get the end point in that direction. When I read articles, anywhere I read it from about China, I read 2 sentences and I already know what the starting point is. Think about that. I want to summarize, or at least finish here with my last slide, saying that ultimately, if we want to understand China's next miracle, we want to understand China better, my suggestion, my advice is to not look at China binary 1s and 0, but look at it more like quantum physics, qubits, quantum bits, because it could be 1 and 0 together. Think about the red and the blue pill. It could also be something statistically between 1 and 0. There's all these combinations possible. It's not just one or the other. And I believe China is like a qubit or a quantum bit. It's extremely dynamic. The only constant is change. That's been my experience. So if it doesn't change, something's happening in China. It's always changing, and that makes it so fast, because they're constantly changing and trying out things and failing and doing the next thing. But China is also very entangled. That's that relationship, Confucianist, Guanxi, relationship, trust-based society that they've built. And because of that entanglement, it's very, very powerful. And we've lost a lot of that power outside China, specifically in Europe, where I believe, where I live. But most of all, China is cyclical. If we continue looking at China linearly, we're only going to see the downside of China. We have to look at China cyclical. Most important, even after 35 years dealing with China, I believe China is still very complicated. It's still very complex. I've been trying to explain a little bit to it now, but I think the only way to truly, truly understand this country and the innovation is that we all study quantum physics. But if you don't have time or energy to do that, you can just start by reading my book. And my first book is available here. Thank you very much. 谢谢。